Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Mike Clegg, Dean of the school, and I want to welcome you to this Dean's Lecture. And as you know, these lectures are designed for members of the school community and outside the school community to come and talk about important topics. And our speaker today really doesn't need an introduction to anybody who's at Hopkins, and he's Rob Lieberman. And Rob came to us from Columbia to become the provost of the university and decided after, I guess, 4 years to step back into the faculty, a step I'm about to take as well. And the day he announced he was going to do that, and I called him up and asked him to come and speak about his research. He is a scholar in studying race from a political science point of view. He's now the Krieger-Eisenhower Professor of the Krieger School of Arts and Sciences in the Department of Political Science, and he was the 14th provost. He was provost at a time when we had uprising, the death of Freddie Gray, and his expertise in understanding race and inequalities made him, during his time as provost, a natural advocate for the role and value of diversity. He's the person who started the highly successful Johns Hopkins University Forums on Race in America, and his work and his efforts led to the development of the recently announced Faculty Diversity Initiative, which is a 5-year program designed to bring outstanding underrepresented and minority faculty to Hopkins. And it's a very innovative program. It works from people who to come as visiting scholars, people to do fellowships here, and then to recruit faculty. So I think race is on our minds, and you know, because of the unrest, but more recently because of the conversation during the last presidential election and what's happened since then. And it was a natural time for Rob to go back to the faculty to work on these areas because they've never been as important as they are now. A little bit about his career. He had a distinguished career at Columbia before he came here. He was an assistant professor of political science, and he rose to become interim dean of the University School of International and Public Affairs. He's written several books. His first book, Shifting the Color Line, Race and the American Welfare State, won the 1999 Lionel Trilling Book Award. He has since published Shaping Race Policy, the United States in Comparative Perspective, and co-edited a Johns Hopkins University Press title, Democratization in America, a Comparative Historical Analysis. He's also co-edited Beyond Discrimination, Racial Inequality in a Post-Racist Era, which was released in August 2013 by the Russell Foundation. He's originally from Boston, received his BA from Yale and his PhD from Harvard. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Robert Lieberman.
Thank you, Mike. It's a great pleasure to be here, see old friends, and have all of you here. So I confess, this is not the lecture that I was planning to give when Mike, some months ago, as he said, to speak here, and we fixed a date for a month after the election. And of course, I had the outline of a beautifully crafted talk to give about some work that I've have done and am continuing to do on race and inequality in the United States. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. This may come off as a little bit disjointed, but I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but also step back and talk a little bit about the deeper and historically rooted politics of race in the United States that have led us to some of our current challenges, not so much local challenges here in Baltimore, but when we think about the national political system and the state of national politics with regard to states. Really just almost some superficial observations, there's a lot more that we could say about each of the things I'm going to touch on, and I will try to leave some time at the end for Q&A. So the title of the talk is Beyond Discrimination. Rather than the boring title slide, I like to use this slide, which is the jacket of the book that Mike just referred to. And what my co-editor and Fred Harris, who's a colleague in political science at Columbia, and I do in this book with a bunch of social science collaborators, is to take on what we thought was an interesting and important challenge. And I should say, this book, we first conceived of this project and the conference and set of conversations that led to this book right around the time of the 2008 presidential election, which was, as we all know, an extremely historic moment in American politics. But it seemed to us that there was a couple of questions that still remained about race in American politics, even after the election or surrounding the election of the first African-American presidency of the United States. And what we set out to think about was the persistence of racial inequality in the face of a decline of the traditionally understood causes of racial inequality. And I'll elaborate on that a little bit in a moment. But this was, cast your minds back to 2008. And, you know, I was at Columbia. Barack Obama is a Columbia College graduate. There was lots of excitement in the neighborhood and on campus when he was elected. And indeed around the country and around the world, with the implication, and I'll talk a little bit about this more in a few minutes, with the implication, the subtext, sometimes the text, that somehow this was an important symbolic moment that signaled an end of an era, that signaled that somehow we as a country had gotten past some kind of, over some kind of historical barrier, or gotten past some kind of a series of challenges. And that we were ushering in some kind of post-racial era. After all, the biggest, we have talk of glass ceilings in the last few weeks and months. One of the biggest glass ceilings in one of the racial barriers in the country had been broken with the election of a black president. And that seemed to us, first of all, not quite right for reasons that I'll talk about in a minute. But also something that required understanding. That is, and here's the dilemma that we set out to pursue. On the one hand, and I'll elaborate more on part of this. On the one hand, what we have seen over the last 50, 60, 70 years in the United States, and I'll document this a little bit in a few minutes, is a dramatic decline, a dramatic change in the things that we used to think of as, or were easily understood as the causes of racial inequality. That is racism, sort of explicit racism, the expression of racist ideas, the belief in quote-unquote scientific racism or biological theories of race, or a whole range of things that used to think of in the social sciences as accounting for different paths for black and white Americans. Racism, understood that way, has declined dramatically. There's a host of law and the legal structures and political structures that used to support segregation and have largely, not entirely, but largely disappeared. And yet, and those changes, as I'll describe in a moment, have led to dramatic changes in the place of African Americans in American society and in American politics. But, here's the but, and here's the puzzle that needs explaining. Racial inequality in many, many areas of American life has not declined. And it seemed to us that social science, that the social sciences didn't really have a very good analytical vocabulary or a very good way of understanding this puzzle. That is, if racism and legal structures of segregation are gone or were in decline, how do you understand the persistence and even increase in some areas of racial inequality? There's got to be some other causal mechanism at work underneath the surface. And we set out to gather a group of colleagues to help us think through that. So what I want to do is talk about that dilemma a little bit, talk a little bit about some of the, this is what I was going to talk about, talk a little bit about some of the policy reasons why some of the things that we think are plausible way of explaining this dilemma, but then pivot a little bit toward the end and talk really more today about the politics of race that underlie a lot of the policy challenges and that helps put a framework around what we've observed in the United States in this most recent election and its aftermath. So the premise of this statement, that is, racism has declined and yet racial inequality persists, might be perhaps somewhat controversial and a little bit maybe confusing just at the moment, especially following the election of Trump. I gave a version of this talk a couple months ago, and I tried to do it without saying the word Trump, and that didn't work out so well. So the veil is lifted. Campaign and what's happened in the aftermath of the Trump election, outbreak of very concerning incidents and expression around the country, head-scratching, to put it mildly, appointments to the White House, to the Department of Justice, and just this morning to the Department of Housing and Urban Development. For those of you who haven't seen the news today, Ben Carson is going to be nominated as Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. His qualifications seem to be that he grew up in public housing. And I think what I want to suggest is that we need to do a little bit of historical archaeology to understand how we got to this point. So just as a preview, what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to briefly outline the historical trajectory of some of the underpinnings of this racial beliefs and understandings in the United States and the work in the middle of the 20th century that destroyed or that took down most of the legal architecture of segregation in the United States that leads to the puzzle. That is the persistence of inequality. I'll briefly talk about, there are kind of two ways to think about this puzzle. One is in terms of policy. That's, as I said, what I was going to talk about. I'm going to talk about that less. That has to do with the structure of policies and the institutional mechanisms by which apparently neutral policies can produce racially imbalanced or unequal results. And the second kind of answer that I'm going to spend a little bit more time on and show you some pictures about is political. That is, the ways in which the structure of national politics and the structure of national political institutions and processes can perpetuate and amplify racial division and inequality in a way that I hope puts a little bit of a framework around recent events. So let's think back maybe 100 years. To the early part of the first half or two-thirds or so of the 20th century. Racial inequality was profound to the extent that people in the social sciences thought about it, which was not a lot. But there were the clear contours. It's not hard in hindsight, in retrospect, to develop the clear contours of an explanation, of an account of why Black and white Americans were so unequal across the board in terms of income, wealth, job opportunities, prospects, education, what have you. And this was a country where white people, for the most part, held very strong beliefs about the truth, the reality, in many cases, the biological reality of racial differences. That was dressed up in science. The origins of most of the social, this is I'm ashamed to admit as a practicing social scientist, that the origins of the social science largely lie in theories of human races. Back to physiologists in the 19th century who you would study cranial capacity of various people from various racial groups, literally putting lead pellets inside of skulls to determine the capacity of skulls of people of apparently different races, and so on and so forth. So there was a sort of scientific underpinning to a set of biological beliefs about superiority and inferiority. So there were prominent, widespread, almost universally held racial beliefs, at least among white Americans. And alongside those things and bolstered by those things, there were sets of laws and policies that enforced and reinforced segregation and the idea of white supremacy. On the one hand, especially in the South, which until the period right after World War I was where almost all of the all blacks in the United States, upwards of 90%, lived in the South, in the former slave states, until there were two big waves of migration north in the 20th century, one during and after World War I and one during and after World War II. So think about Jim Crow laws and laws and customs and policies in the South, laws that required, backed by the Supreme Court in Plessy v. Ferguson, that required separate spheres of life, essentially, for black and white Americans. Plessy versus Ferguson, of course, the famous Supreme Court case of 1896 was a case that involved separate carriages on streetcars in New Orleans. There were laws like that were widely adopted and widely enforced. Voting restrictions were widely enforced. So most African Americans in the South couldn't vote. And these were, state and government enforced and backed restrictions. The federal labor force itself, the federal government, the federal civil service was segregated, both in terms of physical separation of black and white civil servants, but also the availability of job ladders. This happened under the administration of Woodrow Wilson and lasted until, in most federal agencies, the 60s and 70s. You had the sort of typical, in all federal facilities, not just in the South, the fairly standard Jim Crow-like sort of segregation, separate lunch areas, separate restrooms, separate water coolers, that sort of thing, but also separate job ladders. African American civil servants were not able to access federal jobs that led to advancement and promotion up the ranks of the civil service for the most part. Those jobs were reserved for whites. Housing policies, mortgage policies. Anyone know what the origin of the term redlining is? So I'm going to go way over time if I keep telling stories like this. And I should have brought some of these maps. During the New Deal, when for the first time, federal policy was trying to encourage homeownership and to help banks and the mortgage market revive during the Depression. They created a system of underwriting private mortgages. They didn't make mortgages. The government didn't make mortgages themselves. They would essentially insure private lenders so that to grease the skids for banks to make mortgages. But they had to create some underwriting principles. So you want to make sure that you're giving you're underwriting good mortgages, low-risk mortgages. So they did research about big urban areas in the United States, and created a set of maps indicating zones where neighborhoods, areas where the federal government should insure private mortgages. And if you look at these maps and the high-risk areas that were not good bets for banks, and where the government they were arguing the government should be reluctant to insure mortgages, were marked in red. These areas, of course, coincided with areas that were already large at that time, and in most major cities in the United States remain highly segregated and largely African-American neighborhoods. That's the origin of the term redlining. So the whole concept and the terminology of redlining is not just something cooked up by the real estate industry. It was created and given impetus by the federal government. So this was not just sort of an accidental or society-driven set of provisions or set of exclusions or a set of lines. This was state-sponsored and state-enforced. Discrimination was, in this period, was not against the law. It was openly and regularly practiced. That is the idea that, certain jobs were for white workers and other jobs were for black workers, that certain schools or universities were for whites and other schools or universities were for blacks. These were not sort of hidden underneath the surface, unspoken realities about the economic system or the educational system. These were overt facts about the political economy of the time. There were, many states in the South and elsewhere that had separate public school systems for white and black children, explicitly on the books. That's what the whole set of litigation that led to Brown versus Board of Education, in effect, was about. So discrimination was overt, it was explicit, and it was individual. You, individual person, can't have this job, seat in medical school, seat in college, can't go to the school because of your race, right? And there was no need to or attempt to create any kind of subterfuge or alternative language to describe or to justify that kind of exclusion. So that's the sort of pre-civil rights, pre-World War II civil rights movement world. And it's pretty easy to understand. I mean, it's hard to, there are a lot of things about this that are hard to understand, but it's pretty easy to understand how a system like that produces dramatic inequalities in a set of important outcomes between black and white Americans. But then comes, and now I'm going to wave my hands and compress a lot of history into 15 seconds, then comes the Civil Rights Revolution, beginning after World War II, picking up in the 1950s, Brown versus Board of Education, overturns Plessy versus Ferguson, outlaws that kind of explicit segregation, at least in public education, although the government seriously drags its feet in, doing anything about it. But at least they've reinterpreted the Constitution. The Civil Rights Movement begins a very focused and strategic attack on the institutions of Jim Crow in the South, the sort of public accommodations discrimination that we're familiar with historically, the sort of lunch counter, drinking fountain, department store kind of discrimination. And that movement also leads to the adoption of a whole set of statutory changes in the 1960s that I'll talk about in a minute. So a couple of things happen during and following this period in the 1950s, from what I kind of call the long 1960s. Eric Hobsbawm, the historian, talked about the long 19th century, which was like the French Revolution to World War I. It's kind of the 19th century plus. So the long 1960s is roughly Brown versus Board of Education to Watergate. So a number of things happened during the long 1960s. One was, and beyond, one was a dramatic change in the racial attitudes and beliefs of white Americans. So if you look at this, this is just a composite, a compilation of a number of survey results. These are a variety of different surveys, but all of these are series where some survey agency, in some cases I think this is Gallup, in some cases I think it's the General Social Survey, but it's the same question, exactly the same wording, asked at multiple points in time over a long period of time. So you can actually see real change. There are no spurious effects of different wording of surveys and that sort of thing. So you can see, if you ask people, is it acceptable for home sellers to discriminate in sales? Remember, racial covenants on real estate deeds, that is a covenant on your deed that prevents you from transferring your property in the future to a black or a Jew or what have you, are declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 1948, still enforced in the 70s, by the way. But as late as the early 1970s, which is the beginning of this graph, you can see that a pretty large majority of people believe that it's okay for the sellers of homes, for home sellers to discriminate, and in this case the question is about against African Americans, to discriminate in sales, just to decide, I don't want to sell you my house just because you're black. that drops to below 30%. I mean, it's a little disturbing that it's still close to 30% in 2008, but it's much less than it was. Right, segregated neighborhoods, same kind of decline. Intermarriage laws against intermarriage were declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in the 1960s. There's a documentary out about this, which I have not yet seen, but I hear is excellent. And that drops to almost nothing. The question, should blacks and whites go to separate, black and white children go to separate schools, is a really interesting one. Because if you take that series back to the 1940s, Gallup started asking that question in the 1940s, in the very early years of scientific polling. And large majorities of people said yes, yes, blacks and whites should go to separate schools. They started asking the question in the 1980s because it had gotten so uninteresting, because this, to a pollster, is almost close to zero, right? It was no longer an interesting question because the results were uniform. Similarly, if you look at series about whites' beliefs about black people, not about policy, but about black people. Are whites more hardworking than African Americans? Are whites more intelligent? Again, pretty discomforting numbers at the end of the series, but there's a pretty steady decline, right? And that bears some explaining. We can talk about that separately. I'm not going to say anything more about what comes at the end of that series, except to say that it's pretty ugly. But again, a pretty steady decline from very large or sizable, reasonable or large majorities agreeing with these statements earlier. And if you take the series back decades, even larger majorities hold these beliefs about differences and these traits between whites and blacks. At the same time that these changes were happening, or even before these series are sort of later, here's a little sort of capsule history of the Civil Rights Revolution, right? We had a lot of things happened in this period, right? Brown versus Board of Education, I've already mentioned that. There was a series of major congressional actions in the 1960s, the Civil Rights Act, which primarily focused on schools, sort of codifying in federal statute what the Supreme Court had said in Brown, outlawing discrimination in employment, right? It was before 1964, it was not illegal to refuse to hire people because they were black or to sort people into different jobs by race, and the sort of, what we call public accommodations. That's the, sort of facilities open to the public, even private facilities open to the public, restaurants, department stores, so on and so forth. The Voting Rights Act comes in 1965. That puts some statutory enforcement around the protections of the 14th and 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment, of course, 14th Amendment calls for equal protection. The 15th Amendment says states can't use race as a qualification for voting. States got around this in a number of devious and clever ways: poll taxes, literacy tests, the famous grandfather clause. For those of you who are interested in the linguistic origins of these things, the grandfather clause was a rule. These were all adopted in the late 19th, early 20th century, after the federal government gave up on Reconstruction, and after the Republican Party gave up on trying to get votes from African Americans in the South. They sort of let democratic governments in southern states run wild. And they imposed a lot of these new laws, Jim Crow regulations and voting restrictions. The grandfather clause was a rule that was adopted in a number of southern states that said, we're not discriminating on the basis of race in terms of who can vote, but what we're going to do is we're going to put a qualification, not a racial qualification, we're going to put a qualification on voters saying that you can vote if your grandfather was eligible to vote in this state. Well, people who were of voting age in, say, 1900, who their grandfathers not their fathers, you'll notice, their grandfathers had been alive before the Civil War. So an African American who was a free person in Mississippi in 1900, his grandfather, women didn't yet have the constitutionally protected right to vote then, but his grandfather would have been a slave, so he clearly wouldn't have had the right to vote. So that's where the grandfather clause. So next time you talk about being grandfathered in to something, just remember where that phrase comes from. The 1968 Fair Housing Act passed right after the assassination of Martin Luther King, outlawed housing discrimination. That enforcement of that has been fairly weak. And then a sort of amendment to the, not as cataclysmic as the previous, but very significant, an amendment to the Civil Rights Act that empowered the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and the Justice Department to actually file lawsuits against bad employers. That led to some huge, very public settlements, and that kicked off a lot of changes in the way corporations especially organize themselves, that created huge HR divisions in order to comply with civil rights laws. All right, so we have these dramatic changes in racial attitudes and beliefs. We have dramatic changes in the legal framework governing race relations, governing opportunities for African Americans, and governing segregation, which is by now outlawed. So how come, so the question is really, how come so little has changed? That's overstating it a little bit. A lot has changed, but how come so many things remain as they were in terms of substantive inequalities between blacks and whites? I could show you a whole bunch of data on income, wealth, educational outcomes, what have you, that would substantiate that point. I don't have the slides with me. I'm not going to do that because I don't have the time, and you probably believe me even if I don't show the data. So the question is why? And that question is this is the question that seemed to us really urgent, especially in the early Obama years, when there was all this triumphalism about the election of Obama means we're somehow in some kind of post-racial paradise in the United States. Clearly has turned out not to be true. But Obama himself, if you remember back to 2008, Obama sort of himself promoted that idea. He portrayed himself as moving beyond racial division to the most prominent, most successful black presidential candidate before Barack Obama was Jesse Jackson, right? Who had run, and who actually did surprisingly well. But Obama saw himself as the anti-Jesse Jackson. He had built a career as a black politician with multiracial coalitions. It was a great piece. This was when I knew Barack Obama could win. Not that he would win, but that he could win, was during the 2008 campaign. There was a piece in the New Yorker about him that described him sort of hand-drawing a new Illinois State Senate district for himself, to move himself out of the south side of Chicago, Hyde Park, Kenwood, which had been his original base, and to bring in a group of wealthier white voters on the lakefront on the south side, creating sort of this, which was a conduit to a different kind of coalition, a different kind of appeal, and more significantly, a different kind of money. That was when I knew that this guy was a cold Chicago politician, and not just a golden-tongued lawyer, and that he had the cojones to actually win an election. But he crafted his appeal as a sort of pan-racial, cross-racial, non-racial. You saw this in the 2004 speech, which is when he first became well known to the American public. Where there's not a black America, there's not a white America, there's the United States of America. You saw this in the speech in Philadelphia that he was forced to give in 2008. He didn't want to remember the race speech after the Jeremiah Wright business that threatened to sink his campaign for the nomination. and he gave this speech where he very artfully sort of claimed his racial heritage and distanced himself from it at the same time, and sort of put that controversy behind him. So he talked about himself as being a member of the Joshua generation, not the Moses generation who got just up to the edge of the promised land but wasn't allowed in. Joshua, of course, was the son of Moses who led the children of Israel into the promised land, right? So he used that phrase to describe not himself per se, I mean, yes, himself, but to describe his generation's place in the civil rights sort of struggle, or the chain of the civil rights struggle. So he had sort of distinctly positioned himself as post-racial, or non-racial, or cross-racial. But there was, of course, a strong backlash, racial backlash, I would argue, against him. I'll talk a little bit more about that. And so the core dilemma here is between the sort of post-racial moment and the persistence of racial inequality. I could say a fair bit about the sort of policy reasons for this, and I'll be happy to take questions about this. But I don't want to dwell on this now because I want to talk more about politics. But basically, the bottom line on the policy side is there are a number of mechanisms by which what happens is policies that on their face seem to be race neutral and seem to be just the sort of quote unquote ordinary working out of either policy or market forces. Actually, because of the way they operate and because of the sort of underlying inequalities already existing, have racially imbalanced effects that tend to reinforce and in many cases widen previously existing disparities rather than overcoming them. I'll put that aside because what I want to talk about now is what we really need is an account of politics. Why do we see the patterns of politics and the patterns of voting in particular, the patterns of party division that we've seen rear their quite ugly heads in the last couple of months, and especially with this election? And what's the point I want to make here primarily is that as with the sort of arc of policy, there's a history to this. This is not something that just appeared in this election cycle. Even though it was quieter than it was in the last year and a half. This stuff was quieter for a long time, but it was there and it was palpable, and it was critically important in understanding the evolution of American electoral politics and the American party system over the last really 70 years or so. So the biggest mistake that we can make in analyzing this election, and it's hard to analyze the election now, we're very close to it, it'll take some time to sort of collect the data and really think in a more calm way about it, but the biggest mistake we can make is to assume that Trump is an anomaly. Trump is not an anomaly. He's a particularly grotesque version of a politics that's been in existence, and particularly in the Republican Party, although originated in the Democratic Party, as I'll show in a minute, for 70 years or so. So let me just do a couple of things to substantiate that point, and then I'll stop. So this is the Democratic, as the slide says, the Democratic share of the two-party presidential vote. So this is taking out third-party candidates, taking out the Jill Steins, Gary Johnsons, Ross Perot's, John Anderson's, George Wallace's, all of those people. There have been a surprising number of memorable third-party candidates in American politics. Taking out those votes, just dividing up the two-party vote, except for 2016. You'll see there's an asterisk by 2016. That's just the raw vote total. So the orange line on the top is the share of the non-white vote that the Democratic nominee in each of these elections got, from Adlai Stevenson in 1952 to Hillary Clinton in 2016. And the blue line on the bottom is the share of the white vote that the Democratic nominee got, again, from 52 to 2016. Just a little caveat. So these are, up until 2012, these are from Gallup, which they have this complicated measure that is some kind of mashup of the last poll they did before the election that sort of normalized to fit the election results. I don't quite understand the manipulation, but it's the same series all the way through to 2012. As I said, until 2016, this is just the raw CNN. The 2016 data points are just the raw CNN exit polls because Gallup hasn't done their magic yet. So the first thing I want to point out is the relative consistency in these lines since 1964. 64 is an anomaly. That was Johnson versus Goldwater, and I'll talk about Goldwater for a moment in a minute. It was an enormous landslide. It was largely fought around lines of civil rights. Goldwater was one of 6 Republican senators who voted against the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So that was a huge landslide. But since then, there's been some fluctuation, and fluctuation that kind of makes sense. So Jimmy Carter in 1970. Let me see if I can. Yeah, there we go. Jimmy Carter in 1976 did the best among white voters among Democrats since 1964. Bill Clinton in his second go-round did pretty well. Obama held his own among white voters. Among non-white voters, there's been a pretty steady, up and down. Clinton didn't do so well in 92, much better in 96. Al Gore did extremely well among non-white voters. Obama, of course, really well. The drop-off, the first thing to note from this chart is the relative consistency. Small sloping peaks and valleys, but relative consistency of the Democrats' electoral coalition over the last 50 years. The last notice is the drop-off on both of these lines in 2016. Now, this drop-off is exaggerated in this chart because of where I got the data. When we get the Gallup series data, those lines will both flatten out a little bit. But Hillary Clinton did worse in 2016 among both white voters and non-white voters than Barack Obama did in 2012, right? So you can slice and dice the data however you want. She just lost, even though she got more votes. She just lost. 2.5 million more votes, I should point out. So that's an important way of thinking about this. This important thing to note about this election. Now I'm going to show you a couple of maps. You can't do this without maps. This is just census data, county by county in the United States, showing the percent of the population of each county of the United States that's white. It's a little bit counterintuitive. The darker blue counties are more white. The whiter counties are less white. The counties that are colored less white on the map are less white in terms of their population. This is how the census there's this great tool on the census website that does these maps for you. So that's how they did it. So you can see, and these are just divided into quintiles. So the 20% of white, the whitest 20% of counties are the darkest blue, and so on and so forth. Right. So just hold that map in your mind, so you can see where minorities live in the United States: seaboards, big cities, south, southwest, right? Hold that in your mind for a minute, okay? This should be familiar to all of you who watch television or, live on planet Earth. What is that? Sadly, that is the electoral map now finalized of the 2016 presidential election. Red states are Trump states, blue states are Clinton states. Okay, got those two things in your mind? Okay, so that's the census map. Now what I'm going to show you is a map, a similar map to the previous one, but that shows election results by county, right? This is race by county. This is election results by county. This is not red and blue. This is shades of purple. So Red, very red means, that's by size of margin, of electoral margin, right? So the very red counties are the counties where Trump won a very large margin. The very blue counties are the counties where Clinton won a very large margin. The purple, shades of purple are where it was close, one way or the other, right? So you can see, so what's actually quite remarkable about this map is, and I don't have, I haven't run the data to do sort of correlations and really show how closely matched these are, is that, and look at the parts of the country that we've all been focusing on, the upper Midwest, the sort of old line industrial, manufacturing, and mining part of the country that is heavily white, the most heavily white part of the country, and look at that part of the country, right? And if I showed you this map for one of Obama's elections, that part of the country would be considerably more purple, closer to blue, right? So as we know, and I think it's fair to say, the commentary that suggests that the shift toward the Republicans in that part, in the whitest part of the country, was largely responsible for the change in the party control of the White House, among other things. There was lots going on in this election. We can talk about that. All right, just another pair of maps. That's that same map, county by county. And this is one of my favorite maps. There's a guy at the University of Michigan, a geographer, who does these maps for every election. The problem with showing these maps is it looks like everyone in the country except for like 4 people voted for Trump in that election. The problem is we have an electoral system that privileges space over people. So most of these are counties where no one lives, or more, they're more livestock than people. So if you, this is a cartogram where the size of the county on the map is scaled to the size of the population, right? It's a sort of distorted view of the United States, but you can see the very blue places all of a sudden become much bigger, right? So Southern California, the Bay Area, Seattle, the Chicago area, the Detroit area, New England, that's the Boston, New England corridor, that's the sort of New York area, National Capital Region, parts of Virginia, South Florida, and so on and so forth, right? The red parts shrink. You can see here really how close an election this was. The point here is that the patterns that we see in this election are not out of sync with, and in fact very consistent with, the voting patterns that have governed American politics and at the national level for 50, 60 years. And actually the transformation, the changes, the voting changes that we saw were pretty small and very predictable. That's not to say that everyone predicted them. There's some kind of systematic bug in the survey industry that doesn't affect just the United States, by the way. But there's something funny going on. But this is not wildly inconsistent. This is not a sort of completely anomalous, outlier, crazy electoral pattern for us to be seeing. And if you look at these cartograms, you can go to this guy's website at the University of Michigan, and he's got them running back for a few elections. They're fun to play around with. This doesn't look that different from the Obama elections, from the Bush elections, from the Clinton elections, all of which were in historic terms fairly close. And in fact, the second time in the last 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 presidential elections that the Democratic candidate has won more popular votes but lost the Electoral College. So let's go back. Let me just run through. I'm now running low on time, and I do want to leave some time for questions. But let me just run through a little bit of history to describe the evolution of this partisan alignment. Not from the point of view of voters, but from the point of view of the parties and of candidates. You could go back a lot longer, but my first little anecdote is 1948. 1948, of course, was the year that Harry died. This was not the first time that the party was wrong. In fact, even the Chicago Tribune's headline writers and pressmen got it wrong. They went thinking that the governor of New York had won the election. It didn't turn out that way. This is one of the most famous photographs in the history of American politics. But that was a very complicated election. In 1948, Harry Truman won largely on the basis of a strategy that he had deliberately devised to win African American votes in the North. African Americans, as I said, were in the middle of a second wave of migration from the southern countryside to big northern cities, Chicago, the big industrial cities of mostly of the upper Midwest, Chicago, Pittsburgh, Gary, Indiana, Cleveland, Toledo, Newark, New York, and so on and so forth. And those voters, African American voters, were increasingly becoming Democratic voters. For most of the late 19th and early 20th century, African Americans who could vote tended to vote Republican. Why? Party of Lincoln, right? And the Democrats were primarily the party of segregation. This began to change after Roosevelt, and Truman very deliberately targeted those voters in the 1948 campaign. He did a number of things. He issued an order desegregating the military in 1948. He impaneled a presidential commission on racial inequality that wrote actually an excellent report called To Protect These Rights. It didn't actually result in very much policy change, but he symbolically embraced part of what was an emerging civil rights agenda at the time. And he, with the help of Hubert Humphrey, who was then the mayor of Minneapolis running for Senate, got the Democratic National Convention in 1948 in Philadelphia to adopt what we would today think of as a very mild pro-civil rights plank in the platform. At which a bunch of Southern delegates walked out of the convention, reconvened some weeks later in Birmingham, Alabama. This is their convention of what they called the States' Rights Party in 1948 in Birmingham, Alabama. You can see the Confederate battle flags there. Someone on the left of the picture holding up a picture of Robert E. Lee. They nominated Strom Thurmond, who was then the governor of South Carolina, as their nominee for president. Thurmond actually won 4 states. Thurmond was on the ballot, listed on the ballot in Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, and South Carolina as the Democratic nominee for president. Truman wasn't even on the ballot in Alabama. So the Democratic Party begins to split in 1948 over civil rights, which is barely inching onto the national agenda. But Truman, who was a very, very foresighted politician, recognized its growing importance as not just a moral issue, but as a political hook for Democrats who had been capturing, increasingly since the New Deal, capturing Democratic votes. In the wake of this divide, it took a while for the Republicans to catch on, but they sooner or later caught on and began to see these people, white Southerners, as potential Democratic voters. White Southerners had been Democrats for as long as blacks had been Republicans, for exactly the same reason. That was the whites were the party of Robert E. Lee, the party of the war, the party of resistance to the war of Northern aggression and the resistance to Reconstruction, and the party of states' rights, and the party of Jim Crow, and the party of all of those things. And in fact, the New Deal is a very curious mixture of sort of social democracy and apartheid. A former colleague of mine called the New Deal Coalition a mixture of Sweden and South Africa. So the Republicans begin to figure out that these people are gettable votes. That begins, as I said, with Barry Goldwater, comes out of nowhere on the backs of the sort of kooky right at the time, the John Birch Society and so on and so forth, to win the Republican nomination. He beat Nelson Rockefeller, who was the governor of New York at the time, for the nomination. Rockefeller probably would have won the nomination if he hadn't gotten divorced around that time, which at that time was still a no-no in American politics. So Goldwater wins the nomination, as I said, was one of 6 Republican senators to vote against the Civil Rights Act, and wins really, and he wins the same 4 states that won, the sort of renegade Southern Democrat in 1948 plus Georgia and his home state of Arizona, and that's it. Johnson won everything, landslide. Goldwater was also seen as kind of unstable, a little bit crazy. The American Psychiatric Association actually adopted something after this election that is still referred, as a guideline for psychiatrists, it's still referred to as the Goldwater rule, which says that you shouldn't diagnose someone that you haven't personally examined. Since there was a lot of talk in the media in 1964 about whether or not Goldwater was crazy or what kind of crazy he was. In 1968, we had Richard Nixon, who took Barry Goldwater's appeal to the South, pursued a strategy deliberately to target Southern voters, chose as his running mate in 1968 the governor of Maryland and former county executive of Baltimore County, Spiro Agnew, who became famous and sort of catapulted himself to national attention when he was county executive in Baltimore County by trying to find devious ways to prevent public housing from being built in Baltimore County and thereby prevent African Americans from moving there from the city of Baltimore, even as they were being increasingly shut out of good housing in the city of Baltimore. So this is not really about Agnew, this is about Nixon, one of the most diabolical figures in American politics. 1980, Ronald Reagan. Where is Neshoba County? Mississippi. Where in Mississippi? What's this county seat of Neshoba County? Philadelphia. What happened in Philadelphia? Yeah. James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Mickey Schwerner, 3 voting rights volunteers in the summer of 1964, were murdered by members of the Ku Klux Klan. One of the signal horrific events of the civil rights movement in Mississippi. Ronald Reagan went to the Neshoba County Fair to give a speech about states' rights. This was his first major appearance after he was officially nominated by the Republicans in 1980. And he gave a speech about states' rights in Philadelphia, Mississippi. This is at least a whistle, as they say, to a certain kind of Southern white voter who felt increasingly at odds with the Democratic Party. All right, the last thing I want to show you is this is a television ad from the 1988 presidential campaign. This was George Bush, the father, who's we think of now in hindsight as the good Bush, against the reasonable Bush against Michael Dukakis, the governor of Massachusetts. So just if I can indulge you, if you will indulge me for 30 seconds, 30-second spot.
Bush and Dukakis on crime. Bush supports the death penalty for first-degree murderers. Dukakis not only opposes the death penalty, he allowed first-degree murderers to have weekend passes from prison. One was Willie Horton, who murdered a boy in a robbery, stabbing him 19 times. Despite a life sentence, Horton received 10 weekend passes from prison. Horton fled, kidnapped a young couple, stabbing the man and repeatedly raping his girlfriend. Weekend prison passes. Dukakis on crime.
Okay, that was one of the most famous political ads in history. Probably the most famous was the Goldwater ad. I would that one because it's not really pertinent, but you should just look it up on YouTube, the Daisy ad. What's remarkable about this ad is it makes a very clear point about, remember the Nixon button, law and order? It makes a very clear point about law and order, right? Which is a phrase that you heard come out of Trump's mouth a lot in this campaign, right? Dukakis is soft on what the text of the ad says, what the voiceover says, what the words on the screen say is Dukakis is soft on crime, right? He let criminals out on this furlough system, which almost every state had something similar, by the way. This guy, unfortunately, when he was out on a furlough, this is true, this gentleman, when he was out of prison on one of these furloughs, committed another quite criminal act, But if you look at the pictures are extremely revealing. First of all, you can see this, this African-American man, this extremely menacing looking sort of mugshot of this guy, Willie Horton, the guy who, this gentleman who committed this crime, who was not a nice guy, right? But the impact of the ad was to prime people, and there's actually social psychological research that documents this. The impact of the ad was to prime viewers to think about this issue in racially divided terms, right? What did Dukakis do? He let this dangerous black man out of prison who went out and raped and killed a white person, right? That's the sort of unspoken implication of the ad. So, one last picture. Now we're going to fast forward 20 years or so to the Tea Party movement. A couple of the key sort of slogans or themes or tropes of the Tea Party movement: "Take back our country," which sounds similar, very similar to a slogan that is on hats all over the country these days. It's not, the question that immediately presents itself when you see these signs or the slogan is "Take back the country from whom?" And then the whole birth certificate movement. It's inconceivable that if Obama were that the question about the place of his birth would have come up. The point here is that the political moment that we're in and the political platform for these discussions is not a sort of thing of the moment. It's not something that just happened. It's not something that was just dredged up by Donald Trump. A version of this conversation that I had, or a talk that I gave to a different audience some time ago, when we all assumed that Trump was going to lose, I sort of the way I described it was the Republican Party is really lying in the bed that it's been making for 50 years. It looks like, for the time being at least, it's going to be a fairly comfortable bed. But the point is that Trump is, in a sense, and the challenge that we face now in addressing this problem, the challenge of inequality, has even been compounded from the initial question that I put, which is, how do you explain the sort of persistence of inequality in the face of the transformation of American beliefs and American politics and American law? But on top of that, we have to account for what was in this election the at least momentary success of a deeply rooted historical pattern of sort of racially inflected, racially tinged both voting and party building on the part of elites, on the part of politicians and presidential candidates and their handlers and underlings. And that is a challenge that I think we'll be living with at least for the next 4 years. I wish I had some soothing words of consolation at the end of the sermon, but I'm afraid we'll have to the next couple of months and years take us. So I think I've gone over time, but I'm happy to take questions.
It's a very dispiriting talk, and it seems to me that it's a call to action. You were excellent in sort of laying this out for us, this historical pattern, and we have to group together and agree to change the future. We just can't, we can't accept it. So I know it's late, and maybe we can take a couple questions.
So I have one comment and one question. My comment is about Agnew, who actually won the African-American vote when he first ran for governor, because the Democrat was much more of a racist.
Fair enough.
So a little truth there. My question is, given the past 40, 50-year history, the chart you had showing the percentage of white and black votes going to Democrats, why is it so stable?
Because, I mean, for the most part, voting patterns in this period, since the 1960s, things would have looked a little bit different if we had the data to take, let me back up, as best as we can reconstruct the data, things would have looked a little bit different if you took it farther back. But basically, fundamentally, these voting patterns have been extraordinarily stable over this period, right? They're, and I think that speaks to the way in which the parties and party leaders and presidential candidates and members of Congress have thought about both the problem of building a coalition to win an election and the challenges of governing and the problems that they are trying to address when they're in office. And you also see, so you see these sort of parties over this period really sorting themselves out. So that increasingly the Democrats have become, a coalition the Democratic, let me again back up. The Democratic Party has always been a coalition of groups, right? The New Deal coalition was a coalition of groups. There were white Southerners, there were African Americans in the North, there was the white working class, there were some farmers in certain parts of the West, and so on and so forth, right? There's been a pretty stable coalition of groups in the Democratic Party for the last certainly 20 or 30 years, but really stretching back 50 years. And the party lines really broke in the 1960s, primarily over civil rights and a sort of set of economic issues that are attached to civil rights. And you see this in these voting patterns, as you can see. You see it in the kinds of policies that parties generally tend to reach for when they're in office, and you in the sort of appeals that they make to voters. I mean, this is why when you're watching a campaign, you should always take the sort of personality parade and the day-to-day ups and downs with a grain of salt, because in the end, with small perturbations, elections tend to follow very structured regularities, right? The groups vote for the same candidates from election to election, and elections, the American electorate in the aggregate tends to respond to the same sets of challenges, right? Is the economy in good shape? Are we at war? And are things better off for me and my family and my community than they were 4 years ago? Can we get a mic over here?
Has anybody looked at these data by education? I just wonder whether it's also stable by race, subsets of educational attainment by various.
That's one.
Has anybody looked at that?
That's one of the things that seems to be possibly changing, actually, in electoral patterns. So, for most of this period, the Republicans have been the party of the higher socioeconomic status people. That is, people with higher incomes, higher status jobs, and more education. And it's still true, and it's true in this election that on average, higher income people voted Republican more than lower income people, on average, right? All of these are sort of aggregate. The thing that seems to be changing in that pattern is education. So increasingly, college-educated people are migrating to the Democratic Party. I don't think that's these are sort of glacial, like climate-like movements. One election doesn't make a trend, or even a couple of elections don't make a trend. Education seems to be breaking the mold a little bit. I mean, and you sort of, if you live, as most of us do, live in a university community, you sort of see that on most campuses. And you sort of understand instinctively why that's true. Look at the Republicans have sort of taken, look at policies about science or the way they approach science or issues like climate or the things that we care about, the sort of understanding of knowledge and tend to be things that are embraced more by Democratic candidates than Republican candidates. So you can it kind of makes sense. But to some extent, it is breaking the mold of, Republicans as historically the party of higher status, higher SES people, which is why I'm hesitant to say this is sort of the new reality for all time. We'll have to see when the Democrats, if the Republicans, when the Republicans nominate a less weird candidate, if things will revert. That's what we have to wait and look for.
Well, I think lots of people want to talk, but okay, so
Okay,
last
Joanne.
question, and then we'll...
Can I do one quick question?
Yeah, sure.
It seems like there's not been nearly as much emphasis on who doesn't vote. And so I was just interested in whether there is information about sort of trends in who is not voting in these elections.
Yeah, the conventional wisdom is that generally patterns of non-voting don't really change the outcome of the election. So to the extent that you can sort of, there have been studies that sort of survey non-voters. And it's counterintuitive because you'd think, all of the sort of socioeconomic status markers also predict voting. So more educated people are more likely to vote than less educated people. Wealthier people or higher income people are less likely to vote than poorer or lower income people. And whites are more likely to vote than so on and so forth. So you might think that mobilizing more non-voters would change the outcomes of the election. The problem is you have to mobilize so many voters to actually change elections. That's not to say that mobilizing voters is a good thing. We also know that increasingly policymakers are much more responsive to higher income people than lower income people. That has to do with patterns of voting. It's not that who gets elected changes. It's who people in office listen to that matters, and that's more likely to be affected by different patterns of mobilization. So that, to me, is the reason to mobilize voters. Not that you'd elect more Democrats, but that you would get politicians, you'd get office holders to pay more attention to a different array of voices. One last, yeah.
Okay. Thank you for your presentation. I just wanted to follow up on the question that was just asked.
Yep.
Because I've been asked quite a lot about the Bradley effect. So the extent to which people say that they were going to vote for one candidate, but they actually vote for another candidate. So to what extent do you think that that was operational in this election, given that no one really, I shouldn't say no one, but there were people who perhaps voted for Trump but didn't want to publicly acknowledge that they were voting for him, or vice versa. And then just finally, for those of us who are still trying to pick ourselves up off the floor from this election, do you have any suggestions for the Survivor Toolkit?
Well, yeah, right. No, there's a whole dispute in my family about where we should move. My son took some kind of online quiz that matches you up with a country, and he came up with France, although now, given that Marine Le Pen might become president there, I'm not sure that's a good idea. Although it's nice. Food's good. No, the Bradley effect. So there's not a lot of evidence for the existence of the Bradley effect. That is, the Bradley effect this is something that was first noticed in the gubernatorial election in California in 1984, something like that, when Tom Bradley, African-American mayor of Los Angeles, looked like going into election day, looked like he was going to win, and the Democrat, and he was defeated by a small margin of the election. And the suspicion was that people had not been willing to say to a pollster, to a survey questioner on the telephone that they were not going to vote for the black candidate. There have been a bunch of studies that have tried to document that sort of at the individual level. So you look at people, so you sort of find people who answered a survey before the election, and then you ask them right after the election who they actually voted for, and it turns out they mostly voted for the person they said they were going to vote for in the pre-election poll. So there's not a lot of evidence, number one, for the existence of the Bradley effect. Which kind of makes sense. It's one thing to stand up in public and say, I'm voting for the white candidate over the black candidate, but a telephone survey is not a public declaration. It's not anonymous. The person on the other end of the phone doesn't even know your name. They just know your phone number. And most people are most survey researchers would tell you people are relatively uncensored and give truthful answers in those kinds of circumstances. I used to have big arguments about this with my former colleague at Columbia, David, who was in New York City, and was defeated for re-election by Rudy Giuliani when it looked like going into the election that he was going to win by a little bit. So he's of course convinced that the Bradley effect exists. No, but it's not a huge amount of evidence for the Bradley effect. And most of the elections where this seems to appear, that is for example, the Bradley election or the Dinkins-Giuliani election in New York in 1990. This past election where, it looked going into the election like Clinton was a little bit ahead, maybe. They're actually, this election was actually very close. And the polls, by the closing polls, actually had it very close, and it was within the confidence interval, within the margin of error. So it statistically shouldn't be that much of a surprise that Trump won. Despite all of the models, the prediction models that had Clinton winning. So I don't, I think. I'm skeptical of the Bradley effect myself, and I think this is a phenomenon where we notice and we remember the times that it went bad, but we don't necessarily think about the times when there was a close race between a black candidate and a white candidate, and the predicted candidate, the black candidate actually won. Right? Douglas Wilder was elected governor of Virginia again in 1980, whatever that was. Yeah, and that was a close election, and the polls showed him a little bit ahead, and he won by a little bit, right? Polls usually get it pretty close to right, but there's a confidence interval around these estimates, right? And sometimes they're right, not right. And there's no strong evidence of a systematic bias like that in these political surveys. In terms of the survivor's kit, I think Mike got it right. We have to we have to think about the structural underpinnings of this vote. And this is not to say I think it's a mistake to resort to the sort of basket of deplorables logic. That is, this came about not because people who voted for Donald Trump are fill in the blank, right? Even if some of them are. Some of the people who voted for your favorite candidate are probably not the sort of people you'd want to sit across the table from either, right? But I think we want to understand what are these electoral patterns? What do the sort of demographic and electoral patterns mean at a more aggregate level and at a more structural level? And what can we do to, these are very closely fought parts of the country. We're in for a very difficult few years, although thank goodness for the filibuster, right? The Republicans are now in the position of governing. The Republicans who have been a famously well-organized and disciplined machine in Washington for a long time are showing signs of the sort of majority signs of disorientation and disagreement. How that will play out is hard to say. The Democrats have tools. There are some tools at the Democrats' disposal to make life difficult. But we need to think very carefully about how to appeal to a different set of voters. how to appeal to working class voters. One of the most interesting phenomena of this campaign, to me, was that, what it revealed was that for a generation, neither party has done a very effective job of appealing to working class voters who feel like the modern, globally interconnected economy is passing them by. And that's true whether you're talking about steel workers or coal miners in the middle of the country, or African Americans in big inner cities, or certain Latinos in parts of the Southwest. And I think the challenge is to think carefully and systematically about how, at the margins, we're not going to fundamentally change the minds of the 160 whatever million people who voted Republican, right? But where at the margins is there opportunity to make a different kind of appeal, so that within the rules of the system, which is a weird system to be sure, but within the rules of the system, there's some chance. And you're going to see this play out inside the Democratic Party for a long time. You're seeing this argument about who's going to be the chairman of the DNC. No one really cares who the chair of the DNC is per se, but the question is, what does that mean about what's the strategy to both throw roadblocks in the way of things that the Republicans might want to do, and to prepare the way for a different kind, for shifting this coalition at the margins. And all that's going to happen likely is at the margins in the next cycle. That's cold comfort, but we got to. I'll take off my scholarly hat for a moment. We got to just pick ourselves up off the floor and figure out, where the points of leverage are, where we can make a difference, both in terms of legislation and bending the electoral curve a little bit.
Well, I think pointing out that history of thought and action, like how many people under 40 in Maryland know Maryland was a slave state who had all those forms of institutional racism you mentioned? I mean, I think there are things we can do to educate people. I think this historical perspective is really useful in changing people's thinkings, I think.
Great. Well, thank you all very much.
Okay, thank you.